Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 285. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today I am here for what I think is going to be a really unique and cool conversation. I've got Jooyoung Lee here on the podcast. Jooyoung, how's it going, sir?
Hey, Steve. It's great. Thanks for having me.
I am happy to have you, man. We got connected, I believe, on Instagram, and I was just absolutely enthralled by your background. I have been looking for someone like you to have on the podcast for a very, very long time. And to the best of my knowledge, you might be the only person out there with this unique intersection of background. So rather than me explaining it, why don't you go ahead and give yourself a quick introduction, tell people who you are and what your work looks like.
Sure. I'm excited and honored to be on the podcast. I've become like a super fan recently. It's what I listen to on my commute to the dojo. It's great to be on. But yeah, my day job, I'm a sociologist. So I teach sociology at the University of Toronto. I teach primarily upper division undergraduate courses on violence, on social interaction, crime, and on the weekend, I teach a jiu-jitsu class at my dojo on Saturday mornings, and I've also been filling in here and there during the week for the afternoon lunch BJJ crowd. So I love jiu-jitsu, I love martial arts. I also train judo, but yeah, I'm a sociologist by day and then like a jiu-jitsu, judo person the rest of the time.
That's awesome. You know, it's not very common that you get to find someone who is both a jiu-jitsu black belt professor and an actual real professor as well.
Yeah.
I always love finding people in that intersection. Now, this is not specifically related to the topic we're going to talk about here, but I want to give you a second to plug your background and some of the work and the research that you've done. Talk a little bit about that, because that is just such a cool use of your experience to cover this stuff.
Yeah, so my first book, it's called Blowin Up, Rap Dreams in South Central, and it was a long-term study of aspiring rap artists in South Central Los Angeles. So I spent 5 years following a scene called Project Blowin, which is like the kind of mecca of underground hip-hop in South Central Los Angeles, or it was at least the mecca. And, you know, a big part of that research was studying how people develop skills. I also studied the intricacies of like freestyle rap battles. I also followed people as they tried to get signed by record labels. And yeah, that was my dissertation when I was in grad school. And then I ended up turning that into my first book. And then my newer work is much more about gun violence. I did research in Philadelphia and lived there for a number of years and spent some time in the outpatient trauma clinic interviewing people who had been shot and survived and were, you know, struggling and living with different kinds of injuries to their physical and mental health. And that's my new book that I'm completing now. But yeah, so my background is really in sort of community-based research. I go out and I spend time with people, I interact with them, and I learn about their lives at the ground level and kind of write about how they make sense of the world around them. Yeah, so that's a bit about my work, I guess.
That is awesome, man. And the reason why I wanted to have you on here, there's so much stuff that we could talk about with your background, but not directly related to gang violence here, but the name might sound like it, and that is pulling the trigger. That's the topic I want to discuss with you. That is something we've been exploring a lot in 2024 so far. We've had several conversations about this and also a lot of mindset content on our premium service, specifically around this issue. A lot of grapplers have trouble regulating intensity and knowing when and how to turn it up when the time comes. But also, there's also a lot of other grapplers who struggle to manage when they are the receiver of that kind of intensity. A lot of people, for example, when someone comes at them with really the intent to actually do harm, it's pretty easy to just crumble in the face of that kind of adversity. And this is something that I think a lot of people struggle when they try competition for the first time, which is they're just not used to that level of aggression and intensity because you often don't see that in the gym. So with that said, on the topic of pulling the trigger here, I'd love to know, from a scientific background, what's the story here? What is happening in our brains and our bodies when we are struggling to pull the trigger and go into aggressive mode? And alternately, what happens to us when someone does that to us? And how does that regulate our, say, fight or flight response?
Yeah, no, this is a big, big topic right now in a field called micro-sociology. So for those who are unfamiliar, micro-sociology is basically the study of social interaction. And the idea is that the most basic building block of a society are these face-to-face interactions that we have with each other. And in every interaction we go into, the meanings of what's going to happen are always being negotiated or contested, and it's never set in stone. That's kind of one of the hallmark ideas in microsociology. So that's why we study interaction up close so much. And speaking of violence, one of the big kind of studies that has shifted the field somewhat is a study by a colleague named Randall. He wrote this book called Violence. It's just called Violence, a microsociological theory. And Collins has a bunch of data, and he has these great examples that pretty much everybody can relate to. Like if you've ever been at a bar and you've seen two bros who are like intoxicated getting into a fight, you probably realize that most people are bad at fighting. They're not good at violence. And Collins has this theory that says that we're not good at violence because we become overwhelmed with our anxiety. And he calls it confrontational tension and fear. We are overcome by worry, and we succumb to this kind of rush of emotions that takes us out of the moment and makes us, really clumsy and incompetent at doing violence. And he has a lot of other examples too. Like he has records and logs from different wars, and he finds, like out of X amount of bullets that are fired from weapons, a very, very small percentage actually land and hit someone. He has accounts of people who are like hooligans after football or soccer games and like how bad the violence is. And, so the idea is that we become sort of overwhelmed by our emotions, and we're in those situations unable to effectively deploy our bodies into, unable to effectively turn our bodies into instruments of violence. So that's like one of the big themes, I think.
That's an interesting thing to expand on. And it's kind of funny because if you talk to jiu-jitsu people, you'll hear a lot of, I just see red and you don't know my mentality, bro. But it sounds like what you're saying is that violence is not necessarily our default state, but rather it's something that we really struggle with, or at least most people do.
Yes. No, and I think there's definitely some evolutionary biological links as well. Like Collins and, sociologists don't tend to get into that area as much, but, human beings for survival we tend to be afraid of situations that could threaten us. And it's a perfectly normal reaction to be confronted with violence and to want to run and hide, right? So the flight response often wins out because we're, again, programmed to try and survive and try to avoid things that could threaten us. And, I think that in jiu-jitsu, you see this a lot with people who are new to competing, right? They haven't experienced those emotions in the moment. And I've done a little bit of coaching, not a lot, but I've done a little coaching. And probably one of the hardest things for like white belts to manage are those emotions on the day when they have to compete. You can see them getting either overly excited and they go out and they gas out, right? They turn red, as you say, and they have that massive adrenaline dump where they just, for 1 or 2 minutes, they go crazy, beast mode, and then all of a sudden they can't sustain that energy and they crumble. The other response sometimes is the person who just like a deer in headlights who's just frozen. And like, you know, you see them in the gym and the dojo and they're really good and they can do all these different techniques. And then when it comes time to perform, you know, none of that is there. They look almost like a completely different grappler. So I think those are different examples of where that confrontational tension really takes over and it kind of like limits people's performance.
Absolutely. I remember the first time I sparred with someone who I thought was really legitimately trying to beat my ass. I train as a hobbyist, so I'm mostly just in there for fun. And even in a very intense round with someone who's trying to win, you know that they don't really want to hurt you. This is just a game. We're just having fun. And sometimes you try harder than other times and, you know, you get used to that. But I remember one time I was sparring with a guy I'd never sparred with before. And I got the distinct impression that this guy actually wanted to hurt me. And I did not actually get hurt rolling with this guy. I don't think he actually did want to hurt me. I think I just perceived it that way due to his aggression. And it really shut me down. I really struggled to do anything at all because I was just so flustered. And, you know, for a while I was mad about that. Then I realized, actually, you know, I don't think this guy was trying to do this to me. I think it was just my perception. And I realized that this is something I need to inoculate myself against. And so over the years, of course, I've made an effort to train with bigger, stronger, more aggressive guys and learn how to deal with that kind of incoming pressure and how to respond and how to stay aggressive and how to overcome adversity and weather the storm. But it's easier said than done. And like you said, a lot of it, I think, is just inoculation. Again, I'm not a competitor, but the thing that competitors always tell me is there's no way to think yourself into good competitive performance. You just have to go out there and get the reps. Nothing will prepare you for that kind of stress. So the only way to become a good competitor is to compete a lot. And I'd love to hear maybe you expand on that, because I think sometimes people think a good competitive mindset is just something that people are born with and they can turn it on or off. But it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot more at play here. And in fact, most of us are not good at this. It's really just more conditioning than anything.
Yeah. No, I mean, as a sociologist, you know, we as a discipline really talk and think through the lens of social construction. That, of course, there are some kinds of, we all have traits and propensities and personalities and things that make us unique. But the thing that is kind of shared across the board that we know from every single activity that human beings do is that we get better at things through practice and through mentoring and through repetition and exposure, right? There's a sociologist whose work I use in my teaching, actually. His name is Loïc Wacquant, and he did his dissertation in Chicago. He became a Golden Gloves boxer. He competed at the Golden Gloves and started hanging out at a gym on the South Side and writes a lot about this, about the mundane hours spent hitting the bag and like jumping rope and shadow boxing and sparring and just doing all of these things to try and like mentally prepare himself for the day of. And still, even after like years of this monastic training, you know, to become a fighter, a pugilist, he gets to the day of the Golden Gloves and his account is just filled with moments of fear and worry. And he's anticipating, like, what if I, you know, make a fool out of myself and let everyone down? What if I get knocked out? What if he breaks my nose? Or what if, like, in the moment I forget all the things that I've been practicing, right? So it's a constant thing that we have to work against. And I think, yeah, like you said, it's a process of just putting ourselves in those situations. So not only do we get the chance to rehearse the techniques, but we also get to feel those sensations and those emotions and learn how to harness them for performance instead of, you know, becoming overwhelmed and running away.
Let me ask you something here. I'd love to explore whether there is an element of your upbringing or your environment that factors into how you deal with the stuff. Because I think everyone who has trained with fresh white belts has probably seen this before, where most people who come into jiu-jitsu for the first time, they're just like a deer in the headlights. You know, they are either completely helpless and afraid to move, or they're so panicky and freaked out that they just can't make anything happen, or at least not happen safely. But every once in a while, someone walks into the gym and you just think to yourself, this person is just a natural at this. And I've been thinking about this for a while because I've got a guy in mind specifically that I train with. He's not necessarily, at least he doesn't seem like a super athlete or anything. He's just a guy, but he's so confident in his movement under pressure, and nothing that I do breaks his spirit. And that's surprising because I play like an old bastard jiu-jitsu type game where I'm trying to put a lot of pressure on people and ultimately break their spirit. And I can do that to black belt sometimes. But this guy is a white belt, and just no matter what I do to him, just smile on his face. He just keeps going, keeps trying to move the position forward. And I've always been just amazed at how much of a difference just having that kind of mindset makes to his performance. Because this guy, he's a new white belt just like everyone else, but just nothing gets him down. I can cross-face him and bottom side control, and he's still working away, and he's still under full control. And it's really hard to hold him in place, even though he doesn't know what he's doing. So I've always wondered, is there something about the way that people live their lives or the way people were brought up that can give them a mindset like this that's more resilient under pressure? Or is this just like a luck of the draw thing where some people are just like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think all of us, pretty much everybody has a person like that in their gym, right? There's somebody who is not too experienced, but they have these moments or flashes of brilliance, and you're kind of like, where did that come from? You know, it would be hard for me to kind of speculate and say without knowing more about the person's biography, but I suspect that there's some kind of interplay between one, maybe a kind of like life experience where they have had to be resilient and cool under pressure. And so some people have come to jiu-jitsu having a lifetime of experiences where they were under duress and where they had to kind of like think with a cool mind. And so sometimes, you know, there could be experiences that are somewhat invisible to us when we, you know, see students in the dojo that give them a little bit of an edge over the other like beginners and white belts. In other ways, it could also be previous athletic experience. That certainly makes a difference. Like, I think most of us have probably trained with somebody who has like a background in wrestling, or like I train with people who have played like football or rugby and they don't know anything, but they can still really like put pressure on you, and they have a kind of hardiness, like right, their mind and their spirit don't get broken as easily. And I think that's cultivated through competitive sports. So I think there's a lot of people who might have these kinds of experiences in the background that they come into the dojo and like you're kind of wondering like, is this really a white belt that I'm training with? Because they don't feel like a white belt.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think that having a background in pretty much any other type of physical competitive sport is probably going to help you, because even athleticism and strength and attributes aside, just the fact that you've done this before, not jiu-jitsu necessarily, but the fact that you have done a physical competitive activity before, I presume gives you some kind of confidence that you can trust in your body and you can trust in your ability. I remember when I came out of college, my background is I'm a tech guy. I came out and I graduated and I went into the workforce. And honestly, most of the stuff they taught me in school, I never actually really used. I mean, in technology, you know, by the time you graduate, the stuff they taught you is probably obsolete. So there wasn't anything specifically that they gave me that I could apply on the job, really. But the one thing I did get is the confidence that I can do anything. Because if I have been through a very, very grueling educational experience and I came out just fine, I have the confidence that I can walk into a similar situation and do it again, even if it's brand new. And I've always wondered if having an athletic background, even if on its face is unrelated, helps out in this manner, right? If someone is a volleyball competitive athlete and they come into jiu-jitsu, I don't know how much of a crossover of skill there is there, but they're probably going to be a lot more confident in their movement and in their ability than some older accountant who's never done anything physical like this in their life.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. This is something I've been thinking about a lot because I teach mixed levels classes. So some students are a brown belt and they're like really good already. And then there are some people who are doing their trial week where they have never done martial arts ever. They're trying this kind of on a whim to see if, you know, they can get into shape or have a community life, you know. So, and what you see with some people is that they don't know basic things and they haven't had practice just moving their bodies, and they don't have that kind of balance or proprioception. Like they have this kind of like disconnect, mind and body disconnect in the world. And then, you know, you have other people come in. I'm thinking, I had a friend when I was must have been like a purple belt a long time ago. I used to train with a guy who was a break dancer, and he was also a purple belt, but his level at purple belt felt very different than my level at purple belt. I mean, this guy could do windmills and head spins and all sorts of things, and had kind of like used that athleticism and that acrobatic ability and his just awareness and balance, and as you said, confidence in his body, right? Doing something that was very strenuous in his previous life and applied it now into jiu-jitsu. So yeah, I think anytime you have any kind of background in sport or something where you have to use your body in a very specific way, that I think it can really pay dividends in how you learn and how you train.
I was interviewing Livia Giles a while ago, and she said something that really stuck with me. I can't remember what the question was, but I was asking her something about physical performance, and she said she has the confidence that her body will do what she needs it to do. She just has to put it through the work, and it will evolve to be what she needs it to be. And I thought that is actually a really profound thing, because I would assume that the majority of people who are not athletes do not have that kind of relationship with their body. I would assume that more casual practitioners, desk workers, people who are not lifestyle athletes, they don't necessarily look at their body as a tool that they can bend to do what they want, but rather they may even have an adversarial relationship with their body. They may even resent it, that it's not what they want it to be. And I just thought that was interesting, that at that level, people like that might just look at their relationship with their own body differently. And that's kind of when I started realizing that there might be something here about how having experience as an athlete can impact your mindset and make it easier to pick up these other things.
Yeah, no, and I think that's also just a play off of that idea. One of the most profound things I think that beginner students get from jiu-jitsu, they get a lot of things, but one of the things that somebody might take away from training is this sense of belief in their body. This might be one of the first times where they can make their body or do cool things with their body, things that they didn't previously imagine were possible. I think that's certainly, to go back to the sociology account. So Loïc Wacquant's book, it's called Body and Soul, and it explores a lot of these sort of same ideas. He wasn't an athlete. He didn't have like a striking background and then he just became a boxer. Like, he was just a guy who was a PhD in sociology, who just wanted to write about the neighborhood in Southside Chicago and decided, hey, I'm going to go join this boxing gym. It's a good way to meet people. So he was initially thinking of the gym as a way into the neighborhood and didn't think he was going to actually become a boxer, but fell in love with the training and like the culture of the gym and just being on the grind with all of the different guys who are training for fights. And over time kind of acquires these skills and is, in some moments even surprising himself that he's capable of like taking the punishment and doling a little bit of punishment. So I think, yeah, one of the things that a beginner can get from this martial art is really just this sense that, wow, I can do like amazing things with my body. I can like sweep somebody. I can choke them. I can take them down. These are skills that many of us who train for a long time kind of take for granted. But these people who have never had experiences like that, that's like almost like giving them a superpower in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I started jiu-jitsu, for a long time, I just hated anything that was physical, any kind of physical activity. I mean, I hated going to the gym. I hated running on the treadmill. And for a long time, I thought, I'm not into this kind of stuff. It's just not my thing. But then I discovered jiu-jitsu, and I realized that is not the case, that I hate physical stuff. I just need a physical activity that has meaning and purpose. And running on a treadmill just bores me. I don't find it interesting at all. But jiu-jitsu is always interesting. It's always engaging. It feels like you're learning something. It feels like there's a purpose to it. And like you said, I think for many people, this will be their first experience realizing that their body is a powerful tool that they can train and they can use. And I think that's a big part of why jiu-jitsu is so appealing to hobbyists and lay people, is because it gives them that experience, possibly for the first time in their lives.
Yeah, no, I think that's also another cool thing about jiu-jitsu is that you meet some of the most unassuming killers, right? Like, there are people who in their 9 to 5, like I used to train with a guy, he works for a school district, and he's just a very, like, you see this guy and you would never assume that he is just a demon when you lock up with him. Like, he unleashes just unworldly amounts of pressure and tenacity at you. And you have these people who maybe don't have like all these athletic accolades and they have these somewhat normal lives. And then you get on the mats with them and they have this, you realize, as you said, they've been honing their body into an instrument of violence over the years and learning and applying it. So yeah, it's a beautiful, fascinating martial art for those reasons.
Now, let me ask you about actionable advice that we can give to people here. It sounds like the big thing you're saying is that inoculation is key. And if you want to get better at pulling the trigger, you just need more practice in a live and realistic environment. But that does take some time. It might take months, maybe years before you develop that kind of confidence to go out there and perform at that level. For people who are maybe just starting out, or for people who perhaps have been doing this for a while but are still struggling at this, is there anything in the moment that you would suggest to people if they feel themselves hesitating and they want to overcome that? Any kind of mental tricks or things that they can do to push themselves into the right mindset in performance mode when they need to go?
Yeah, in the moment, that's interesting because the big picture, of course, is, as you said, inoculation. It's just exposure, getting so many repetitions where the next time you go to a competition or you're training with somebody who normally beats you, you're not worried anymore and you're just kind of like totally in the moment. I think for the moment, I can't remember where I heard this, but I think someone told me once about how your physiological reaction when you're scared or anxious is quite similar to when you're excited. And if you can just kind of tap into that and say that your body is really just getting ready to perform and do great things, like the anxiety and the buildup and all of those different emotions that are swirling around in your mind and body before you go out and compete are really similar to how you would feel if you're super excited. If you can kind of find a way to transfer this confrontational tension and fear into something productive, into something that helps mobilize your capacity, I think that's the key. And there's probably different triggers, if you will, for each person. Like people probably have different things that kind of like get them into that mindset. But I think too often the big one is that people are getting ready, they're overthinking, they're kind of like pacing, they're like really imagining all the worst case scenarios and they're succumbing to that confrontational tension. Their emotions are getting the best of them. Every person, I think, has to find a way to harness that and turn it into something productive.
Yeah, reminds me of something that Nick Perler, wrestling coach out of Missouri, once told me, which is that when he's coaching athletes and they're about to go on stage and they are just overwhelmed with anxiety, he tells them, you don't need to be anxious here. You should be excited. This is what you wanted. This is the opportunity. You get to go out there and perform and put yourself out there in front of all of these people. This is an exciting thing, not a scary thing. And I think that that kind of reframing is very powerful because the law of contrast, right? You can't just stop a thought. You can't just tell yourself, don't think this negative thing, because by definition, if you're giving attention to the thought, it's not going to go away. You know, if you're telling yourself, don't think of this thing, you have to have that thing in your mind to be able to hold that thought. So reframing to something more positive, like anxiety, reframing that into excitement is something that I've heard before. And I think that's very good advice as well. I also love the point you made about just having a performance trigger, something that you can think of that will help reframe you in a snap moment there. And that is a good example. If you feel that anxiety arising within yourself, to just acknowledge that and then think, well, this is actually really exciting, and make that just an immediate trigger. I think that can help a lot in terms of getting your mindset from something negative to something that's more productive. Yeah.
I didn't mention this when we first interacted, but so I had a background in competitive swimming, and before jiu-jitsu, I was a NCAA D1 swimmer at Berkeley. And, swam with lots of people who were better than me but I was in that world of competitive swimming. And one of the things that we used to do a lot is visualizing before big meets, we would go into a room and turn the lights off and just imagine all the things that were happening, not only during the race, but the day of, like getting to the pool, warming up, stretching, sitting there as the announcer is calling your heat to go up, and standing on the blocks and imagining what it's going to feel like when your feet are on the little traction on the racing blocks, diving in the water. Like we used to go through the whole sort of process. and then just imagine the outcome that we wanted. And we would kind of do this over and over again. Back then I was a 20-year-old kid who I don't think I fully got what I was supposed to get out of these exercises. But now looking back, I realized that this was actually a really important lesson in a way, because it was getting the mind ready for the stress of that moment, right? And like one thing I think that happens is that if an athlete goes out and they are going to compete, they're overwhelmed with emotion because they feel like everything is so new and uncertain. And I think the more you can kind of, again, rehearse and inoculate or expose yourself to what's going to happen and the swirl of emotions, that the better off you'll be and more equipped you'll be to respond in a good way.
Regarding visualization, I'd love to know if there is any scientific backing behind this, because I have talked to many high performers who use visualization. I have used it myself. I have found it quite helpful. But I mean, you know how human beings are, right? The placebo effect is real. I would love to know, is there a scientific basis for visualization? Obviously, it's not the same as actually performing. But if you think of a jiu-jitsu competitor, even if you're really active, you're probably only going to have one competition every few months at most. So does visualization actually have scientific backing as a supplement to help inoculate yourself against this stuff? Or is that something that's still kind of unknown at this point?
I think it's mostly unknown. I mean, there might be some people in psychology who have looked more closely at this. But one thing we do know in sociology is that when people envision their futures, they sort of end up taking actions that turn these visions into like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think, we probably still don't have the science to say that it's like this good supplement. But, if we abstract a little bit from what we know about like how people anticipate the future, right? We know that like when people anticipate, they plan. And when they plan, they tell other people, and those other people hold them accountable. And maybe they do little things like little exercises or take small steps towards realizing these kind of future plans. So I think that there's a little bit of evidence, but I wouldn't say that we have enough yet to make a strong claim in that regard. But I think, anytime you are thinking about the future and anticipating some kind of outcome, some desirable outcome, you are already taking steps towards that. And it could be small things like just telling somebody and then they point you in a good direction to start, or they remind you of these goals and they kind of keep you on track, right? So there's a whole kind of world that mobilizes around these visions. So I think that there's something to be said there, and I would love to read that. I just don't know offhand.
Maybe I need to find a visualization specialist. I actually would be very curious to explore the science and the evidence behind this more. But as someone who has deployed visualization at a very elite level, do you have any pointers or suggestions for people who might want to apply this practice in their own lives? Anything that worked for you when you were an NCAA swimmer, or any other suggestions that you've picked up over the years that would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing is like, it has to be a practice like anything else. It can't just be something that you decide, okay, my competition's in a week, so now I better get on it. It has to be something that's built into your training, and it's something that you do kind of recurrently. I used to find myself walking around in the midst of everyday life daydreaming, but what I was daydreaming about was the end of the season, where I would have a big meet and I would sometimes just envision looking up at the clock or the scoreboard and seeing like a time that I was trying to aim for. Now, it didn't always work, but I feel like the big one is that it's like any skill, it's something that you have to cultivate and you have to nurture over time, right? And sociology is really big on this. It's like, if you want to develop a skill, you have to first make it a habit, and it has to become embodied. It has to become second nature in a tacit form of your whole being. So it has to be something that's just sort of natural part of your everyday life. And the more you do that, the more, it becomes stronger as well. So if you want to then compete, I would say it should be something that is built into your routine and not just something that you do right before you have to go up.
Now, here's something I want to ask you. You can inoculate yourself against a lot, but there's so much variability in terms of what can happen in a jiu-jitsu match. And no matter how much you try, you cannot prepare yourself for everything. And at a high level, one of the things that your opponent may try to do to you is do things that fluster you and throw you off your game. And no matter how experienced you are, there's always going to be the possibility that they can deploy something that really just messes with your head. Let me give you an example. Rob Biernacki from Island Top Team has been promoting this new submission that he's got called the Roadhouse choke.
I've seen that on Instagram. Yeah, it's hilarious.
It is. I mean, but it's interesting because for those who don't know, and we have actually an episode in the backlog with Rob talking about this, I definitely recommend people give it a listen, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But what it is, it's a choke that relies on using your hand to frame against the person's throat. It looks like you're doing a Homer Simpson choke where you're grabbing their neck by one hand and you're squeezing. You're not actually doing that, though. That's not legal under a lot of rule sets. But what you're doing is you're posting on their throat, and it's possible, if you do it right, to get enough pressure on their carotid arteries that they go out. And what Rob has talked about is when you do this to someone, it triggers such a visceral panic response in a lot of people that even if they're super experienced grapplers, they start to make a lot of mistakes. And that is something that I have noticed over the years as well. There's a lot of things in jiu-jitsu you can do that, maybe it's not technically a technique, like pushing on their head or pushing away on their neck, but it flusters people if you do that. And a good grappler will look for ways to fluster their opponent, and you can't inoculate yourself against everything. So, what do you do in a situation like that where someone is doing something that you never thought they would do, like they start grabbing your throat and it starts getting inside your head in the moment? Is there anything that you can do when you're in the moment and you're facing that kind of adversity head on?
Yeah, I mean, aside from doing it back to them, I mean, okay, so here's another kind of strain of background. So some of my past work was on improvisation, and, a lot of people think improvisation or the ability to freestyle or just kind of like be creative in the moment is an innate characteristic. Some people have it, others don't. But there's a lot of interesting work by colleagues in ethnomusicology who are people who kind of study how people make music. And a lot of the work is done on jazz players, and they study very closely how people learn how to improvise on the piano and other kinds of instruments. And the interesting thing they find, which applies to hip hop as well, which is where my study kind of came in, is that the ability and the skill to improvise in the moment is born out of the kind of drab, mundane, monotonous repetition of basic foundational techniques. So, there's a guy named David Sudnow who wrote this book called Ways of the Hand, and he was a sociologist who became a jazz pianist, a piano player, and he recorded in a kind of reflexive way what it was like to stumble through and try to learn and teach himself how to play piano. And what he learned over time through other people kind of coaching him and his own practice was it all begins with those basic scales, just like familiarizing yourself with the basic scales. And improvisation is really then just deploying those scales in kind of like creative ways. And so they've been modified a little bit when you play a new song, and they're never the same. But the same thing, I observed the same thing with rappers, like these rappers who would come up with these just crazy rhymes in the moment, things that you couldn't script or write down in a premeditated way. They would just it would just happen. But as I spent more time with them and learned about their craft, I saw the same thing. They were, writing words in the dictionary and then trying to come up with as many different rhyming words based on a random word that they selected. And they would reuse the same kinds of go-to lines or premeditated lines and modify things slightly for the moment. So I think that there may be a lesson there about the ability to improvise both attacks and maybe escapes is something that's born out of just really just repeating and repeating and repeating and doing all of the little foundational moves over and over again. And I think the other thing is really, of course, if it's making you panic, you have to find a way to not panic because, again, if we go back to the whole theme of pulling the trigger and the micro-sociology insights, when you are scared and when you are anxious, you will make mistakes and you will become incompetent. That's the whole kind of like insight from the book I was mentioning by Randall Collins. It's like if you are overwhelmed with fear and panic, you're not going to be good at what you're doing anymore. You're going to go into that very base level survival mode. And that's not technical, and it's probably not going to translate well into competition. So I feel like there has to be a way to, maybe it's per person. Everybody might have their own way of calming themselves and finding a way to get out of that panic state.
Yeah. You touch on something that I've heard elsewhere. In The Art of Learning, Josh Waitzkin talks about this idea he calls making smaller circles. And what he's really saying is that if you want to learn and excel at a new skill, you need to identify what are the base fundamental things you need to understand and really practice those to a level of mastery. And then you can kind of bolt on all of the weird variations afterwards. And that sounds very similar to what you're talking about regarding freestyle. I've always wondered how musicians are able to just freestyle entire songs. It seems absurd to me that that's even possible, but I realize that it's actually probably a lot like jujitsu. Jujitsu is evolving so fast and so quickly that it is almost impossible to keep up with all of the new techniques being invented. And I have found the thing that has allowed me to hang with those people who are throwing all of this new stuff at me is I try not to think in terms of the techniques. I try to distill jujitsu down to a series of very, very basic, simple mental models. I mean, that's the whole point of the show, right? Is what are the mental models behind jujitsu? And I just focus on those. So if someone is throwing something at me I've never seen before, my focus is on things like, okay, how do I maintain my base? How do I maintain my posture? How do I maintain my structure in this moment? How do I prevent them from getting superior access to my elbows, to my knees, stuff like that? And if you do that consistently, then it doesn't even really matter what kind of move the other person is doing because you can sort of freewheel it and figure it out on the go. I found that approach to be very helpful to learning things. And it sounds like, out of all things, you found some crossover there into the freestyle rap world, which is super cool.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is actually very important for people to remember. Jiu-jitsu, I think what makes it so fascinating and addicting is that it's so deep and complex at its core, right? There's always, as you said, new moves being invented, new grips, new ways of setting things up. It's impossible to really keep up. And I think you can get lost in the trees, so to speak, by thinking like, I have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or else this match is not going to go the way I want it to. But, there's also something to be said about just keeping your eyes on these kind of foundational ideas. Like, I think one thing that helped me a lot when I was earlier in my journey, somebody said to me, when you're on the bottom, you're playing guard, like you're really just trying to rock their base. You're trying to make them lose their balance. And that can happen in a lot of ways. And if you're on top, you're trying to solidify. You're trying to hunker down on the person and pin them. And, a lot of the stuff will kind of happen and there will be things that you improvise and no situation will be exactly the same. And so I think that there's something really important about that, of keeping that in mind, because it can be overwhelming and that can lead to that, that mental state of being overwhelmed again, where you're just like consumed by details. Oh, he's got this grip. What am I going to do now? Do I have to do this or that? And like, sometimes there's more kind of like basic things that you have to kind of keep in mind. And I think in a general way, that's also why learning the basics never kind of goes out of style, right? Like there's something to be said. Maybe I'm kind of like an old bastard jiu-jitsu person too at heart. It's like all these new things can kind of come and go, but the basics are kind of like timeless in that way.
Absolutely. Especially as you get older, you run out of patience with having to chase every single new trend. And it's like, I just want some mental shortcuts that I can use. I think people are often surprised at how little I actually know about jiu-jitsu in terms of techniques and moves. People always come to me and say, hey, Steve, what do you think of this weird guard? And I've never heard of this in my life, but I'm reasonably sure that if you tried it on me, I would be able to come up with an effective response just by understanding the fundamentals. Something else you said, though, and I really want to dig into this, is this idea of survival mode. You talked about how if you're in survival mode, you need to get yourself out of there fast. But maybe explain to me what this is, because I have some thoughts. But first, tell me, what is quote unquote survival mode and what's happening inside your body when that triggers in you?
Well, survival mode is really, again, just you're faced with an imminent threat, something that's making you feel very uncomfortable and at unease. It could be in the context of jiu-jitsu, maybe, as you mentioned, a choke or a move that you're unfamiliar with. And for that fleeting moment, you're suddenly thrown into this chaos where you're like, I don't know what's going on. right? And we all had that experience when we started jiu-jitsu where you're just overwhelmed, and the person who was a blue belt felt like a god compared to you. They just like did things and you're like, how did you do that? They had this kind of out of this world strength or technique. But yeah, and I think survival mode can be so bad for in a competitive sense, because you're suddenly thrown into just base level instinct. I have to get out of here regardless of how I do it. I just have to alleviate this pressure. I have to change the situation immediately instead of finding a very pragmatic and smarter way to get out of trouble. You're just kind of thrown into desperation, and you have that sense of urgency that pushes your body into, again, that fight or flight. Oftentimes that immediate kind of visceral reaction where you're trying to get out of trouble is not the smartest move. Like, it might alleviate the pressure, but it might also set up the next attack. So that's kind of how I think about survival mode. It's like that the adrenaline is pumping, you're faced with an imminent threat, and you have to do whatever it takes, and it has to be fast. It has to be done quickly. Now, of course, there are moments where you want to explode out of situations, but I think pairing that with a kind of more reasoned and thought through process is probably the best way to go.
Yeah. You bring up some great examples about panic in the moment there. This is what I love about the pressure game is you're trying to inflict that mental state in people. The meta right now is don't just try to complete the guard pass as fast as you can. Make the person suffer, make them panic, make them start to make mistakes. And that is such an awesome thing when you feel that happening in your opponent, because you could be sparring with someone who's really, really high level, but at some point, if they realize they're really screwed, they're going to start to get desperate. They're going to start to make mistakes, and that creates openings, and then it just becomes a downward spiral for them. So you astutely bring up that when you are in survival mode, one of the first and most important things that you can do is get yourself out of survival mode. It's hard to improve your situation if you're in that panic mental state. Interestingly, this is a strategy that gets used in team management in computer software. One of the things that I've always deployed is, when you go into a new team and your job is to help fix things up or address problems, you need to first identify, is the team in survival mode? Because you cannot really make things better and make big improvements and get their buy-in until you've removed the pain points that put them into that mental state in the first place. So where a lot of managers screw up is they'll be brought in to fix some underperforming team, and they'll be like, good news, everyone, we're implementing casual Fridays. Everything's going to get better, right? And you'll never get buy-in doing that, because if people are there and they're overworked, they're underpaid, they're stressed, they don't feel respected, they hate every waking moment of being on the job, you cannot come in and just wave a magic wand and make things better. You need to get them out of survival mode first and foremost. And I think that applies very much in jiu-jitsu as well, where if you are in that mental state, you need to address that and find a way to get out. And similarly, if you are attacking someone, it is in your best interest to try to force them into that mental state, which is where the whole pressure game comes into play, right? Is you're trying to make them break mentally so that they start to make mistakes they normally would not make.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, you're speaking a language. So my senseis, Jose Montero and Ana Felix, they come from the old school. So they're judokas and jiu-jitsu black belts. And that's the whole style. It's crush the person's head, crush their will, make them wilt, they're going to open up, and that's where you attack. And something you also said about how teams kind of manage crisis and survival mode reminded me of parenting a little bit. It's like one of the hard lessons I've learned with parenting with a small child is that when a toddler's in the middle of a tantrum, that's not the best time always to kind of make the correction. Like, you got to get them out of that state. You got to get them out of that survival mode, out of that chaos. And then you can have the reasoned conversation. But it's like finding the way to kind of switch their brain out of that fight or flight, that adrenal response, and putting them into a calmer state of mind before you say, hey, you shouldn't be breaking a hole in the wall. That's not a good idea.
Yeah. As a parent, I can relate, first of all, because I am perpetually in survival mode with my child. Yeah, but also, right. You're absolutely right. You cannot reason with someone who is being controlled entirely by their emotional state. And having young children is a great way to learn this, because you simply cannot rationalize with a kid who's panicking like that. You need to get them out of that state first and foremost, and then you can have a more reasoned conversation with them later. I think the similar thing applies when you're sparring with someone in jiu-jitsu, both in terms of how you regulate your own emotional state and how you try to break their state as well.
Yeah, no, it's one of the cool things about jujitsu. I think it's really fascinating when you can develop a game where you do things that inflict discomfort and it masks what you're setting up, or it opens another possibility up. It really kind of trains your mind to be very flexible and to see opportunities that are emergent and not just like scripted per se. It reminds me a little bit. So I have a friend he's a jiu-jitsu black belt, this guy, Adisa Benjoko, and he's a chess player as well. And he has this metaphor for, I think it's used in chess, and I'm not a chess player, so I might butcher it, but I think the term is called Zugzwang, and it's a German word.
Yes, I know the term. I think it's, you know what, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it's basically the boa constrictor philosophy, right? You just keep strangling them, and every mistake they make just tightens the knot a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. You put people in situations where they have to make a choice between bad moves, basically. And the pressure can kind of do that. It's like, do you want to keep having the pressure, or maybe I'll turn away and then now you can take the back, or here's an arm instead of the pressure.
My favorite thing to do now is play what I guess you could call level 3 stack passing, right? I guess the level 1 stack passing is you try to stack someone and get to side control. And then level 2 is you try to stack someone, but you make them give up the pass. You make it so uncomfortable that eventually they have to let you pass. My favorite thing to do now is what I call level 3, which is they want to give up the pass, but I don't even let them do that. I just hold them upside down for as long as I want them to. That really messes people up because they can't do anything. I'll go for a stack and I'll hold them and I'll make them uncomfortable. And then eventually they'll, I can see that they're thinking, okay, fine, I can see this. And they try to throw their own legs to the side to give up the pass. And I just sit there going, nope, we're going to sit here for as long as I want to sit here. I'm going to hold you upside down on your shoulders with your legs dangling in the air like an idiot. And eventually it gets quite amusing. I love doing that to the younger, super explosive athletic guys who want to turn everything into a scrap because they just look so stupid. You're just holding them upside down for an extended period of time.
No, that's the Old Man Game 101. I love that episode, by the way. Like, it was a great one because I also love the stack pass, especially in the gi, because you get that little collared grip and you can lift their pants up and put the knee underneath the spine. It's just a terrible situation to be in. Like, your human body's not meant to be bent like that. Like, you're sort of being folded into like a lawn chair almost.
Yeah. Even though some people can do it unsafely, like we talked about with Mike Pekarski, you can do it pretty safely if you've got them on their shoulders and you're not trying to hurt them. But I find these days when I'm going for that, I'm not trying to put my weight down on top of them even. I'm just trying to plant them on their own shoulders and lift their legs off the ground so they can't do anything. I don't have to squish them. I can just hold them there and they're in a completely useless situation because they have no base.
Yeah, no, it's a terrible feeling for sure.
Now, the last thing I want to ask you is, what about people who have kind of the opposite problem? Whereas instead of struggling to pull the trigger, maybe they're always in trigger mode and they have trouble de-escalating within themselves, because this does happen. There are people out there who are aggressive to the point of being uncontrolled. And I would want to get your feedback on that. When someone is always in that high alert state to the point where they may not be a great training partner, they've probably been told this, they've probably been told they're dangerous, or maybe their permanently heightened state of arousal is impacting other areas of their life because they're making bad decisions. Is there anything that you can do if you're on the other side of the equation where you're trying to settle yourself down rather than trying to jack yourself up?
Yeah, no, we all have those experiences as well with people who are just kind of ready at a drop of a dime, and they kind of like bring that into the training room. Well, one, I would say, yeah, like to maintain a good collegial culture in a gym or dojo, like you probably want to teach them how to train in different gears so that they're not injuring everybody and causing people to stop coming in. But two, the other thing we know about these heightened states of arousal or these like moments where we're overcome with emotion and adrenaline is that it's very short and episodic. You know, most violence in the world, if you observe it, like hand-to-hand violence, is very fast and fleeting. And micro-sociologists would say part of that is because injury, like grave injury, like ceases the violence, it turns into something else or it stops, but also because the emotions needed to sustain violence are kind of like they burn out really fast. And so I think if you're constantly in that state of mind, like, yeah, you have to find something that will help take your mind out of there and out of that kind of frenzied way of being. You know, it might just be an activity that's totally unrelated to jujitsu or a martial art or whatever thing you're going to get into. It might be something that just brings you back into another present moment that's not fight or flight. And I think that's, you know, a lot of this is really about just being completely present in the moment and mindful and not just, you know, overcome by the fear or the excitement that emerges when you're in violence.
Yeah, especially in the training room. It's very, very hard for some people to make that mindset shift where they realize they're not there to win, they're there to learn. And that means sometimes you don't want to go at 100% and use your A game. You want to be exploring new areas. You want to be allowing bad positions to happen. You know, man, when I was a white belt and a blue belt, I made so many dumb training decisions because I thought the objective of training was to win. So, you know, I did a lot of stuff that probably significantly increased the risk of injury to myself and my partner because I just would not cede anything. And overcoming that is a huge boon when it comes to getting better at jiu-jitsu and being a better training partner as well, because no one wants to go with the guy who's always going to try to kill you every single round.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I've noticed, and I used to be like that when I was a brown belt and I was going for my black belt, I don't know, there's a part of me that felt maybe the imposter syndrome, or maybe I just really wanted to prove that I deserved it. So every time I would roll, I would try to like submit people and just really go for it. And now maybe it's like I'm getting a little older. Now I don't have as much to prove and I'm in a teaching role now more. But I find it really refreshing when you can tell that a person is holding back a little bit and is sort of playing jiu-jitsu instead of just fighting you. And you get to these situations where you're like, okay, if the person really, or if I really wanted to get this submission, I could go for it, but I'm just going to let it go. And we're going to keep this kind of playful dialogue happening where I do stuff, you do stuff, and it's going to, at the end of the road, we're going to have seen more situations and we're going to have built more of a database, so to speak, of things that we can kind of be on the lookout for. And so, again, I think going back to the whole rationale for the mundane training, learning the foundations, the skills, like anytime you can kind of like expose yourself to more scenarios, as stressful and as uncomfortable as they may be, that's only going to help you in those moments when you have to compete, because then you will have seen and experienced that, and you'll probably have developed different ways of managing or countering whatever's happening to you. So you don't want to just do your A game all the time and then get to the competition and then suddenly you can't play your A game and you're like freaking out.
Great advice, man. Well, Jooyoung, I really appreciated all of the time here. This is a great chat, but I want to make sure I give you a chance to close the show here. Any last thoughts you wanted to share, things that are important that we didn't get a chance to talk about here today?
No, I mean, I've just really enjoyed hearing this podcast. I think it's a great resource. And I started listening a lot when I went back to teaching at my academy. And yeah, it's just cool because I feel like I've met people who have also been on your podcast through the podcast. Like I've, through social media, met different people. And it's kind of nice realizing that you're not the only nerdy person in jiu-jitsu, that there's a lot of other people who are kind of cerebral and into the nerdy stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I like about jiu-jitsu is that it attracts all types. You do have the crazy, aggressive athlete young people, but then you've also got a bunch of older, more analytical people like us. And I think jiu-jitsu's ability to be a big tent like that is one of the coolest things about the sport. I've never tried any activity in my life that has introduced me to such a diverse group of people as jiu-jitsu has. So I'm very grateful for that, as I am for the opportunity to chat with you. I will put links to all of the resources you discussed in the show notes, but if people want to follow you or check out your work or maybe contact you and ask questions, how do they go about doing that?
I think the best way would be through Instagram or Threads. My Instagram is Jooyoung Lee, and Ju is spelled the first part of my name is Joo, and then Jitsu Lee. So yeah, I'm on Threads and Instagram a lot. And yeah, I'd love to connect to people, and that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, as I always do, I will put all of those links in the show notes. So if you want to check out Jooyoung's book or chat with him on Instagram or see any of the other resources that we discussed here, just a tap away, go to your podcast player, hit info or whatever it's called, and it should be there in the show notes. I will also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. We're closing in on 300 episodes of the podcast here. The goal of BJJ Mental Models has always been to be the world's top education podcast for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So we don't do a lot of current events or random interviews. Every episode has a purpose. You should be able to go back and listen to the very first episode and still get as much value out of it today as 5 years ago when we first recorded that thing. We also actually recently launched a new podcast. It's all in the standard BJJ Mental Models feed. So if you're already subscribing to the feed, you don't have to go anywhere to get it. But we started releasing mini breakdowns of key mental models for jiu-jitsu. I recognize that a lot of people have not been with us since day one, and so maybe they don't have the introductory framework we talked about at the beginning. So I've been trying to put together better ways for people to get up to speed. So if you subscribe via your podcast player or check out the podcast on our website, you will see new mini episodes coming out once a week going forward. Our newsletter is also about to close 10,000 subscribers, so I do suggest signing up for that as well, and I'll put the link in the show notes there too. And of course, all of this is powered by BJJ Mental Models Premium. It takes a lot of time and frankly money to put this together. We have always prided ourselves on being a notch above in terms of content and quality when it comes to jiu-jitsu educational material. So if you want more of this, if you want a more structured approach, if you want direct coaching from some of our black belts on our review team, and perhaps most importantly, if you want to really connect and build relationships with some of the coolest people in the sport, join BJJ Mental Models Premium. We've got a bunch of different plans to accommodate your needs. It's extremely affordable for what it offers. Check out the website and you'll understand why I say that. bjjmentalmodels.com is where you can go to check that out, and your first 7 days are free. So if you don't like it, you can try it at no risk. But if you're like most people, if you're like the getting close to 600 people who do like it, I think that it's something you'll probably stick with. So again, please do check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. Everything is at bjjmentalmodels.com, and I will put a link in the show notes. But Jooyoung, thanks so much for coming by. This is a fantastic chat. Like I said at the beginning, finding someone with your intersection of experience, a black belt in jiu-jitsu and a doctor and professor of sociology, that is a super cool area to explore. People like you are the reason why I do this podcast. So thanks so much for coming by and being so generous with your time and knowledge.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Most welcome, sir. Thank you to the listeners as well. Truly do appreciate everyone who spends time with us here each week, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.